2019 is upon us, but before I can start looking ahead to the new year, I've got one last video to put out. It's time for another quarterly wrap-up, and this time I seem to be going through the video game equivalent of seasonal affective disorder. From a reality warping journey through hell to a dark story about self-harm, most of the games this winter get dark and heavy. It's not quite all doom and gloom, however, and just like the winter season, this wrap-up does have an occasional ray of sunlight that manages to sneak through the clouds. But whether they're cheerful sweet nothings or heavy introspective works meant to make you think, every game on this list is worth checking out. If this is your first time here, hi, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. And today is a wrap-up of a bunch of fun little indie games that have come out since the start of October. The only requirements are that they're good, and that you can finish them in 5 hours or less. And we're starting our list with one of this season's strongest titles, Gris. Gris is like if someone tried to turn an interpretive dance into a video game. It's the closest we've ever come to getting another Journey since, well, Journey. It's an emotional landscape, a raw mood painted across a screen, an allegory for the experience of a single emotion: grief. It's beautiful. But that's nothing new. If there's anything you've heard about this game since it came out a few weeks ago, it's that it's beautiful. It's all pretty much anyone can say about it because it's 90% of Gris's appeal. The puzzles and platforming that make up its gameplay are simple and sparse, almost to the point of being a formality. The game is linear without much opportunity for exploration, and there's not much in the way of a concrete narrative to attach oneself to. So all that's left to lean on is Gris's visual and audio aesthetic. But, surprisingly, that's enough. Gris tries to be a video game second, and an allegory first. And that allegory of the grieving process is a well-executed one. The game is soaked in the iconography of loss and sorrow, and the main character is physically haunted by the dogged specters of her bereavement. And from there, the game walks through the slow, uneven process of recovery, of literally reclaiming pieces of yourself as you move on. That's the appeal of Gris, and I'll admit, it's probably not for everyone. But if you're ready to take that emotional dive, if you're willing to look at the game on its terms, you'll find something there. I'll admit that I'm a little torn on Gris. On the one hand, I feel like video games as a medium just aren't the best fit for this work of art, that some of its few gamey aspects are its weakest elements by far, and that it would have been best suited as an avant-garde animation project that could just hit you with a non-stop feels train. But I'm also aware that video games are probably the only medium where you could have done this specific project and actually seen anything remotely approaching commercial viability. Something like this would have never made it to the big screen. It would have dwelled in obscurity, an art house short film with a cult following at best, and maybe a moment of notoriety on social media. Better perhaps, then, that it settled where it did, where it has a day in the sun. But either way, I'm glad that I was able to play this one. But believe it or not, Gris is actually not the most melancholy game on this list, despite being a game literally about being miserable. That honor goes to the missing, J.J. Macfield and the Island of Memories.
Why try to step back in time?
This is a side-scrolling puzzle horror game where the puzzles are all solved by putting the game's protagonist, JJ, directly into harm's way. It kicks off when JJ and her friend Emily hit up a mist-shrouded island off the coast of Maine, where I'm pretty sure literally nothing good has ever happened in any story ever. After their first night, Emily goes missing, and JJ has to risk life and literal limb to chase after her. Along the way, JJ has also developed the miraculous ability to survive no matter how badly maimed she gets. And often she'll have to purposely hurt herself to progress, sometimes using severed body parts as weights and sometimes using her own body as a torch to burn away vines blocking her path. From having to listen to JJ screaming as she's lit on fire, to the gross sounds and movements when she's walking around with half the bones in her body broken, only to stumble and fall over with a wet splat, there are so many little details in this game that make it all feel rather disturbingly realistic, and sometimes like it kind of borders uncomfortably on torture porn. Luckily, there's a point to this beyond creatively exploring the most excruciating ways to maim a young woman. The game about literally tearing yourself apart to achieve an objective unsurprisingly makes for fertile ground to plant a message about self-harm, but the Missing's plot is also inextricably tied to LGBTQ topics that would technically count as a spoiler, but are about as obvious as that one train car you get run over by midway into the game. Overall, JJ's emotional state is about as battered as her physical one, and as with a lot of great horror, the physical terrors on screen are all symbolic and tangled up in JJ's own personal traumas. Whatever hand-wringing I might do over the game's blood and severed limbs, it is true that The Missing makes something meaningful out of it all, and creates a unique, interesting puzzle game in the process. Phew. So, after those two games, I think we're in desperate need of a palate cleanser. Which means it's time for something completely different. It's time to talk about The Haunted Island, a frog detective game. Whereas the last two games were ultra-heavy, melancholy explorations of the miserable side of the human condition, The Haunted Island is an hour-long comedy about, well, a frog detective investigating a potentially haunted island. The setup is straightforward. Someone thinks their island has been haunted by ghosts and called in a team of scientists to investigate, but they're stumped, which means the next natural candidate for getting to the bottom of things is an old-fashioned detective. It's all wrapped up as a detective game, but in reality, this is all just an elaborate excuse to have a chuckle talking to some of the most mind-bogglingly incompetent people in existence. The Haunted Island's comedy is the driest variety of British humor possible, with a detective going about having polite, sincere little conversations with the island's batshit denizens. No statement or situation in this game is too absurd to not be delivered with a straight face, and the frog detective carries the entire game's humor by playing the most affable straight man in existence, just merrily going along with whatever absurd nonsense that comes his way like it's another Tuesday at the office. Mechanically, there's not much here. A few simple dialogue trees and adventure game bartering puzzles. This game rides or dies on its jokes and its upbeat tone. But if dry humor is your thing, or you just want to slip into a lighthearted little adventure for an hour, Haunted Island's got you covered. On the opposite side of the spectrum from Haunted Island, we have a game so mechanically focused that almost its entire story is wrapped up in a wordless intro cutscene. Next on our list is Nowhere Patrol. Hey look, I found a boss rush game! Nowhere Patrol probably isn't my favorite in the genre, but it's still a solid entry. The game pits you against a castle of giant, sentient household objects in a pure, no-frills boss rush, and those bosses are really well designed. They're a bit more methodical than bosses in other games, always going through the same attacks in the same order and encouraging you to memorize the fight like an MMO raid boss. But that doesn't mean they're pushovers. Fights can often drag on through 4, 5, sometimes even 6 phases, each with their own dance of attack patterns to memorize. And because of how quickly damage recovery wears off, you can find yourself losing half your health from a single misstep. I don't consider myself to be much of a slouch when it comes to these games, but I ended up bashing my head against this guy for 2 hours until I finally broke through. Which unfortunately brings me to my sole complaint with Nowhere Patrol. There is no saving. You either make it through the entire game in one sitting, or you run out of time and try again. I personally cheated and just left the game running and paused for like a day, but if you only have an hour or two to sit down and play, I can imagine it'll be extremely frustrating to bash your way through half the bosses, only to just have to call it quits and go back through the whole game again next time. And reaching the end of the game is only the beginning. While your first run or two are obviously going to be more about surviving to see the credits, Nowhere Patrol asks players to come back again and again and perfect their abilities. If you manage to beat a boss without taking a single hit, you'll be rewarded with a final, extra powerful phase where the boss activates their final form and stops pulling punches. The few times I've managed to get a boss to this point, I've gotten absolutely demolished. So there's definitely a high skill ceiling to pursue on this one, whether you pursue it for a few hours to see the credits, or you come back again and again. But speaking of coming back, there's one game that came out this month that feels like it's come back straight out of the 90s in every way, from its look to its execution. I'm talking about Dusk. If you've ever enjoyed a 90s shooter, you'll probably like Dusk. Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, Hexen, Quake, Dusk is a love letter to the olden ways of shooting things before scientists developed the chest-high wall and reinvented the way man waged video games forever. Doom is probably one of the most foundational games of my childhood, so you can sure as hell bet I'd be on board for this one. But for those not immediately sold by the thought of reliving the 90s, let me break this game down.
Kill the intruder.
Dusk checks all the boxes a 90s shooter would. Blistering run speed, breakneck combat, an unrealistic armful of weapons that all have their situational strengths and weaknesses, that old, chunky pixel art, regular inclusions of old bosses as new rank-and-file mobs, and encounter design that constantly mixes up different packs of enemies with its level design to put the player in new, interesting situations with the same familiar obstacles. But more importantly, Dusk has a complete mastery of tone and pacing. It knows exactly how to make you feel vulnerable and on edge in levels like the Cuddy Mine, where you're forced to move back and forth through a winding maze of dark, tight corridors filled with invisible enemies and monster rooms that open behind you. And it knows exactly how to create a pitch-perfect moment of destructive catharsis, like this one moment where after 4 hours of fighting tooth and nail against the forces of evil, you're handed a full pack of ammo and told to just go ham and wreck everything. Dusk shifts tone almost at will, jumping from full-on action to light atmospheric horror to surreal segments where the world slowly starts breaking down around you, and it executes all of these moods, as well as the transitions between them, with a deft hand. Just recreating the shooters of old and giving me a treadmill to consume new content on probably would have been enough to make me content. But this willingness to play with its tone is what puts Dusk over the top and keeps it feeling fresh and different from the games it's inspired by. That's it for this quarter's wrap-up of games, but there are 2 more honorable mentions before I go. This was a fantastic quarter for video games, especially this past month's deluge of indie releases. There were so many that even with a wrap-up dedicated to playing through all the games I missed, there are still a few that slipped through my fingers that I desperately wanted to be on this list. The first is Gal Metal, a wacky rhythm game for the Switch where you play as the drummer for a Japanese all-female metal band fighting off an alien invasion. It sounds incredibly weird, incredibly Japanese, and incredibly fun. The other is a visual novel that seems to have passed by unnoticed called Distress, a choice-driven sci-fi adventure. Distress features over 80 endings to its branching narrative, and while I haven't gotten a chance to start playing it, I'm eager to see just how much each of those endings diverge from each other. So if either of those 2 sound equally exciting to you guys, maybe check them out and report back in with how they are. And be sure to let me know in the comments about any other short, awesome games that have come out recently and I've missed. The more cool game recommendations, the better. In the meantime, if you're looking for more recent short titles, I've got a whole long backlog of reviews you can check out. Seriously, I do this all year round, so you can find a ton of great short games that will absolutely blow your mind. And if you like this video, hey, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.